Did you know there's an area known as the Coffee Belt? Do you know where it is? The Coffee Belt is the location where all coffee is grown, and the geographic area is around the equator. Did you know there's a National Coffee Day? It is September 29th. Or did you know that coffee is a red berry before it's a bean? The coffee plant grows berries and the seeds are known as beans. Or did you know that the coffee got its name from Arabic from the meaning wine of the bean? In America, 50% of the population drinks coffee, and the average American drinks 3 cups of coffee a day. There are 11,000 Starbucks and 8,000 Dunkin' Donuts in America alone. With the coffee market being worth around $18 billion in the United States, why is this drink so popular? Coffee improves your energy levels, mood, and other aspects of brain function due to the caffeine that is present in the beverage. Caffeine is the most consumed psychoactive substance in the world, and when drank, it leads to a stimulant effect within the brain. Coffee contains essential nutrients. It includes riboflavin, pantothenic acid, manganese, potassium, magnesium, and niacin. Also, coffee contains a massive amount of antioxidants. Studies show that people in the Western Hemisphere get more antioxidants from coffee than fruits and vegetables. Coffee may lower your risk for type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, and liver failure. This is because of the impact caffeine has on one's brain and nervous system and the nutrients found in coffee. Now that you know some reasons why coffee is good for you, let us discuss the different types of coffee beans there are. Generally, coffee is characterized as light, medium, dark, and darkest. Light roast has the highest acidity. Medium roast tastes richer, and there's a balance between acidity and body since it was introduced to the roasting process. Dark roast is bolder and the least acidic since it went through a roasting process. Lastly, the darkest roast, known as espresso, is the strongest of all the coffee roasts since it roasts the longest out of the 4 types. As for the bean itself, there are a few very common types. Arabica and Robusta are the 2 most common coffee beans. Arabica beans are high in flavor and least caffeinated. This bean makes up 70% of all coffee drinks. Robusta beans have less oil, which causes them to have a more bitter and acidic taste. This bean is also cheaper, so it is used in blends everywhere. Robusta beans have around 50% more caffeine compared to Arabica beans. Now you might be wondering about espresso beans. Espresso beans tend to be Robusta blends under extreme pressure through a roasting process, which allows the coffee to be stronger and bolder. Now that you know about the different types of coffee beans and roasts, you now should figure out what you should tell the barista you want to drink. So, if you want a milk-based drink, you could order a cappuccino. It's espresso, steamed milk, and froth. Or you could order a latte. It's espresso, steamed milk, and very little froth. Or a flat white, which is espresso, steamed milk, and no froth. A cafe mocha is like a latte with steamed milk and espresso, and also they include chocolate powder. Or you could get a macchiato. It's a layered drink with steamed milk on the bottom and espresso on top. Or, if you don't really like espresso, you could get a cafe au latte. It's steamed milk in regular coffee. If you don't want to drink with milk, you could order a short black, which is just a shot of espresso, or you could order a cafe americano, which is a shot of espresso and hot water. And if you add whipped cream to this, it's known as a Vienna. Or, if you're feeling like you really need a boost, you could get a red eye, which is a coffee with a shot of espresso in it. Or you could just go for the basic route and make your own coffee with milk, cream, sugar, Splenda, etc., or however you'd like it. And a majority of these drinks could be made iced or hot.
Have you ever thought about how that cup of coffee you just bought was actually made? Not in terms of the cream and sugar you added, but rather how the coffee plant was used to make your drink. The first step in the production of coffee would be to plant the seed. Coffee seeds are first planted in shaded nurseries. Then, once they're strong enough, they are removed and planted elsewhere. After about 3 to 4 years, these coffee plants will finally bear a fruit called the coffee cherry. Yes, you heard right. Coffee plants actually bear cherries. Once the plant bears those cherries, there are 2 different ways to harvest them. One way is to strip pick them, and the other is to selectively pick them. The strip picking method involves picking off all of the cherries from a branch. Meanwhile, the selectively picking method calls for individually picking the cherries only once they've reached the peak of ripeness. As you can imagine, this requires a lot more labor and is more costly as well. For this reason, selectively picking is usually only done to harvest Arabica beans. Once the coffee cherries have been picked, they are transported to a processing plant. There are two different ways those coffee cherries can be processed, the dry method and the wet method. The dry method involves letting the coffee cherries dry in the sunlight. They are raked over multiple times a day to prevent them from getting spoiled in the sun. They sit in the sun until the moisture content of the cherries reaches 11%. This method of processing is quite simple. The wet method, on the other hand, is a little bit more complicated. In the wet method, the coffee beans are first passed through a pulping machine to separate the skin and pulp from the bean. The beans are then separated by weight and size. The beans will sit in a fermentation tank for 12 to 48 hours to dissolve the mucilage layer. They are then rinsed with water and are dried to 11% in the sun. After it is dried, the beans are passed through the hulling machinery to remove the parchment layer around the beans. The beans are sorted and defective beans are removed. The beans are now called green coffee. This green coffee is now exported and then tested for quality and taste. Taste testers, which are called cuppers, first check the visual quality of the coffee, then they test the aromatic quality, and finally its taste. The green coffee is now roasted in roasting machines at 550 degrees Fahrenheit. After the beans have been roasted, they are cooled in water or in air. The coffee is then grinded and brewed and finally served to you. Now that you know how regular coffee is made, you may be wondering, what's the difference between regular coffee and decaf? There are many different ways to make coffee decaffeinated, but the most common way is to enlist the help of a solvent. Remember when we talked about green coffee? Well, that green coffee will be soaked in water and methylene chloride or ethyl acetate. These solvents work to remove the caffeine. Another method is called the Swiss water process. This process involves soaking the green coffee in water. This makes the coffee release its caffeine and coffee solids. That liquid mixture is then passed through a carbon filter. That carbon filter stops the caffeine but allows the coffee solids to pass. You now have a green coffee extract that contains water and coffee solids. A new batch of beans is placed in the green coffee extract, and the caffeine from the beans will diffuse into the extract since there's no caffeine in the extract. The extract is again passed through a carbon filter, and the process is repeated until the beans only have 0.1% caffeine. A third method to decaffeinate coffee is very similar to the Swiss water process. Instead of using a carbon filter, this method removes the caffeine using sparkling water. So have you ever wondered why some people like their coffee more bitter than others? Obviously, it's personal preference, but what brings about that preference? Studies have found that people who have lower caffeine metabolic rates perceive the same coffee to be more bitter than those with higher caffeine metabolic rates. It has also been found that those people who have lower caffeine metabolic rates tend to add more sugar to their coffees.
Coffee is a worldwide traveler, though its origin remains a mystery to this day. The coffee adventure begins with an Ethiopian legend that told a story of a goat herder, Kaldi, who was thought to be the first to discover the potential of these delicious beans. In the legend, it tells of Kaldi discovering the beans' magical powers after having let his goats eat a coffee plant. After his goats ate the plant, they became energetic and excited all day. Amazed by this discovery, but still weary of his potential find, Kaldi shared his findings to the local abbot, who decided to try the plant himself. The abbot was amazed at his alertness and energy throughout the entire night after eating the plant's cherries. Thus, the power of coffee began to spread. It first moved east toward the Arabian Peninsula to the country of Yemen in the 15th century. However, by the 16th century, coffee spread to Persia, Egypt, Syria, and Turkey. Interestingly enough, coffee houses were popular places for social activities, not unlike today. Coffee houses became such an important center for the swapping of tales or information that they were nicknamed as schools of the wise. The fame of coffee spread like fire. However, coffee sub 1555 consisted of crushing up the coffee cherries and stewing them in a drink. This did not change until in Istanbul, the Ottoman palace began the tradition of roasting coffee beans and then grinding them to stew in water. This change of use only increased coffee's fame. By the 17th century, coffee had traveled across Europe, infecting Italy, England, France, Germany, and Holland with its energetic effects. In 1668, coffee finally reached North America, which subsequently spread coffee farms throughout the land and surrounding islands. However, the New World's preferred drink of choice was tea. This did not change until 1773, when King George III imposed a tax on tea. This forever altered the American drinking preference to coffee. Coffee flourished across the world, and farms increasingly popped up as the market for coffee only soared. This leads us to today, where over 83% of humans drink coffee in the U.S., which equates to roughly 3 cups of coffee a day per person. Unfortunately, this tasty treat comes with a cost. Coffee is the world's second most tradable commodity, right behind oil. It is a multi-billion-dollar global industry and has not stopped growing. With such a high demand, coffee is grown to maximize the yield, which often leads to serious damage to Earth's ecosystems. Coffee is typically grown in tropical areas at high elevations. Traditional grown coffee was a key part to the agroforestry system. This was where tree species were cultivated together with coffee and other agricultural commodities to decrease climate change, reduce deforestation and degradation. This meant coffee plants often grew underneath the shade of the nearby trees. By growing trees, coffee, and other plants together, the land remained a valuable habitat for indigenous animal species and prevented topsoil erosion. Due to the prevention of topsoil erosion, farmers ultimately had to use less chemical fertilizers on the land. However, as this type of growth did not produce the highest yield of coffee, it became overlooked by most farmers. Sun cultivation techniques became popular among coffee growers. This is where coffee is produced on plantations where forestry is cleared and monoculture occurs. This type of production, aligned with fertilizers, produces the highest yield of coffee, but eliminates the diversity of plants and animals, ultimately leading to a detrimental effect of biodiversity on the region. In addition, due to the increased use of sun cultivation techniques, over 2.5 million acres of forest have been cleared in Central America alone in order to grow this precious crop. Incidentally, 37 of the 50 countries in the world with the highest deforestation rates are also major coffee producers. Deforestation has harmed the critical ecological systems on the land through water quality, wildlife species, and atmospheric dynamics. Coffee beans also contaminate waterways through the processing of these beans. The amount of discharge from coffee processing plants is a huge part of river pollution, which kills aquatic plants and wildlife. Without a doubt, there is an enormous amount of waste produced during the manufacturing of coffee. The process of separating the beans from the berries generates enormous volumes of waste in the form of pulp. In 1988, during a 6-month period, a survey estimated that 547,000 tons of coffee was processed in Central America, generating as much as 1.1 million tons of pulp, and thus polluting 110,000 cubic meters of water each day. All of this excess pulp causes serious damage to soil and water sources, as the pulp is most often just dumped into streams, negatively affecting their fragile ecosystems. Only in recent years have prevention methods started to take place. by including the compost of coffee husks with farm animal manure to use as organic fertilizers on farms.